Chapter 8. Sandefjord, Norway, 1880. With the long grey afternoon giving way to early evening, Christian Bornholm doffed his hat and used his sleeve to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He had a bit of trouble explaining to folks who knew him that the simple fact that he was an archaeologist, and this was his dig, did not mean he could avoid picking up a shovel. He knew men of his profession who took that approach, but Professor Bornholm had always felt he got more from his men if he joined them on the dig, mixed his blood and sweat and dirt and exasperation with their own. Sometimes it paid off, times like now. "She's a beauty, Professor," declared Henrik, a man in his late 40s who had been with Bornholm for a dozen years, perhaps more. Henrik was a thickly muscled man with a broad back and a bit of a stoop from spending most of his life with a shovel in his hands. "That she is, my friend," Professor Bornholm replied, stroking his grizzled beard, feeling the grit trapped in it. "That she is. Now we must try to find a way to move her safely. A problem for tomorrow, I think," Henrik replied. Bornholm glanced at him, saw the exhausted smile on his friend's face, and the two men laughed together. They stood there as the shadows lengthened and the other men passed on their way home. The diggers in the artifacts team the professor had put together all waved and called out to him and Henrik as they left. Bornholm was drained, but quite pleased. They had accomplished something incredible. "I think I'll head home as well, Professor. Aren't you coming?" Henrik asked. He glanced up at the darkening, overcast sky. "We were fortunate that the rain held off all day, but it will not hold off forever." "In a bit," Bornholm told him. "I just want to sit here a bit. Besides, I've got to wait for the sentries to arrive. Can't expose a find this valuable and then leave her to fend for herself." Henrik chuckled at that, patted the professor on the back, and then walked off toward the road to town. It was more than 4 miles, but they all walked the route regularly, as long as it was warm enough. On the ridge of excavated dirt that ringed the dig site, Bornholm stood and stared proudly down at the most significant find of his career. The Viking ship had been built, he believed, between AD 820 and 850. It was 70 feet of solid oak construction, 16 feet wide, and only 5 feet deep. The shallowness allowed the Vikings to not only sail upon the ocean, but to travel up rivers and fjords, aiding them immensely in both war and trade. The vessel had been buried in blue clay for more than 1,000 years, and was in extraordinarily fine condition. It would have had a sail, of course, but also the long oars of the age. At least 60 oarsmen would have been aboard, though half of them would have rested while the others rowed. Upon the ship, Professor Bornholm and his excavation team had found several beds, 2 sleighs, a pair of harnesses for horses, a massive iron cauldron, and the bones of 41 men, all of whom appeared to have been executed. Bornholm only wished he knew why. Another ship that had been unearthed in a blue clay burial mound only miles away had supposedly housed the body of a king, and its interment was an honor. But it seemed that in this case, the opposite was true. Wherever these Viking warriors had done, it had been despicable enough to warrant their deaths, and their burial with numerous runic inscriptions that must have been wards against unearthing them. But why bury the ship as well? Unless it had something to do with their crime. They were not kings, but some kind of criminals. Bornholm was more than puzzled by these mysteries. He was completely confounded. He would decipher the past, though. Of that he was quite certain. It was fortunate that he had such a generous benefactor. Almost as though summoned, that very gentleman appeared beside Bornholm, soundless as a ghost. The professor gasped and then put his hand across his chest, so startled was he by the newcomer's arrival. "Mr. Charn," Bornholm said quickly, flustered. "I had no idea you intended to visit the site this evening. I would have prepared." Charn snickered. It was an unsettling habit. "I did not want you prepared, Professor." The man had cruel eyes, and was thin enough in body and face that gave his overall appearance the unflattering effect of reminding those who came in contact with him of a vulture. For those who had ever seen a vulture, of course. But those carrion birds were the first thing Bornholm had thought of upon meeting Charn. The creatures that picked over the remains of the dead. That was Charn, all right. Despite his wealth and his willingness to bankroll whatever Dick Bornholm suggested, Charn was no archaeologist. His interest was in stripping historical finds of their value and selling them on some kind of black market. Bornholm did not know much, and wanted not at all to know more, but he had not liked Charn even before he realized what the man was up to. Something about his eyes, and the sneer on his face, the way he snickered, as though he knew so many things Bornholm did not, and was playing the professor for a fool, somehow. Well, Bornholm knew what was going on, and he made a decision to stick with it. At least the sites would be excavated, discoveries would be made. What were a few ancient trinkets among hundreds of one-of-a-kind archaeological finds? Charn wore a heavy jacket and boots like the diggers wore, and he had on a hat that was far from cold for this time of year. Despite his thinness, the man's hands were huge, with long, thick fingers. It was so extreme as to almost be a deformity, Bornholm had always thought. "So you're to remove the ship for transport tomorrow, eh?" "Well, that depends on how long it will take us to get it out of the hole, but soon enough." Bornholm confirmed. With a little snicker, Charn turned to size Bornholm up with a cold stare. The professor frowned, not understanding what had elicited this response. "We are moving as fast as we can, Mr. Charn," he said. "I can see that," Charn agreed. With a smile that he might as well have painted on, Bornholm regarded his benefactor again. "Have you given any more thought to that Egyptian excavation I was hoping to do next season? The funding?" Charn ignored the question. "Did you find the chest down there aboard that ship?" The professor sighed. "Yes, sir. Once the Viking remains were removed, we discovered the box beneath them. It has been left untouched as you instructed. I have either been present myself or had sentry standing guard ever since the ship was unearthed." The smile on Charn's face was uncharacteristically warm. "Excellent," he said, and laid a powerful hand on Bornholm's shoulder. "A job well done, Professor." With that, Charn started down the mound of dirt and into the hole dug around the Viking ship. Bornholm chafed at this breach of etiquette. It was his dig. This was history in front of them, and whatever came up ought to have been catalogued and analyzed by antiquities experts first. But Charn had funded this and many other digs, and the professor could not deny him. Had never been able to deny him, for Mr. Charn always wanted something from a dig, always had some rare knowledge of an item he expected to find with each new excavation. So Bornholm said nothing as Charn descended the slope. With a sudden jerk, as though he had struck some sort of invisible wall, Charn came to a halt, halfway into the hole. He stood perfectly still a moment, fists clenched at his sides. With the clouds so thick above, and the last light of day almost completely faded, Bornholm could only barely make this out. That thought led to another. Where were the sentries? "Bornholm!" Charn shouted angrily, without turning. "Is something wrong, sir?" the professor asked. It was clear to him, though, that there was something wrong. Charn turned to glare at him. "Get me the box, Professor." He almost argued. A bit of rebellion rose up in Bornholm, and he nearly told his benefactor to get the damned box himself. Why was it necessary for him to descend into that pit when Charn was halfway down there himself already? Then he thought better of it. It was only a small thing he was asking, really. Bornholm had spent weeks with a shovel in that very same spot, and he loved to be around the ship anyway. Only a small thing. With a sigh, he started down the dirt mound as the darkness closed in. It was almost fully night now, and his eyes were adjusting. Though the clouds were thick, there were places where the light of the moon and stars broke through. When he passed Charn on the wall of the pit, he saw that the man's jaw was set in a grim line of fury. He had hoped he had not been the cause of Charn's anger. That would not bode well for the Egyptian project. He paused briefly at the base of the mound, outside the ship. Wooden beams had been put in place to make sure it did not topple while the excavation went on. Makeshift stairs had been constructed to allow simple access to the vessel, and Bornholm went up them quickly. At the back of the ship was a large chest of wood and iron. There was no lock. Despite Charn's warnings, Bornholm himself had looked inside, and nearly wept at the sight of the wealth within. Jewels and medallions of gold, goblets and bracelets made of finer craftsmanship than should have been possible 1,000 years earlier. Might well be impossible now. It was an archaeological find of enormous significance, never mind how rich it would have made him. But Bornholm had learned not to question Charn. If he knew the chest was there, he likely had expectations regarding its contents as well. And in the past, more than once, the man had actually taken items from a dig only to return them to Bornholm later, dissatisfied in some way but eager to move on to the next. Reluctantly, he hefted the chest and carried it to the front of the ship, then over the side and down the steps. When he looked up, he saw that Charn had not moved any closer, but had also not retreated back to the top of the mound. He stared expectantly at the chest, and Bornholm was unnerved by the intensity of that gaze. The professor lugged the box to where his benefactor stood, halfway up the slope, and placed it on a level place on the dirt in front of him. Charn frowned at him. "A little farther, please," Charn muttered. Bornholm raised an eyebrow. The damned chest was right in front of him. Was the man so unreasonable that... The professor glanced back at the ship, then down at the chest, and finally back to Charn. A flare of fear in his heart made him swallow hard. The image of the man stopping on the hill, as though prevented from moving any closer, came back to him, and he thought once again about the men executed and buried here, wondering what horrible crime they had committed, what sin. They were never intended to be found, he thought, and if they were, someone made sure that certain types of people could not remove the ship, or anything on it. Certain types of people, or not people. He stared at Charn, telling himself it was lunacy. "Move the box farther up the hill, Professor Bornholm," Mr. Charn said calmly. Bornholm bit his lip. "Once you have done so, we can discuss the funding for your dig in Egypt." The professor closed his eyes tightly, then, fear and loathing filling his heart, for he knew that whoever or whatever Charn was, the Norsemen who had buried this ship had never wanted him getting hold of it, or its contents. It nauseated him. But Bornholm could not help himself. Charn was his benefactor. The Egypt dig might be the one that gave him the fame in his field that he had sought for so long. He bent and lifted the chest again, moved it several feet farther up the side of the mound, and placed it in the dirt again. Charn grinned, but there was no trace of warmth in it this time. "Well done, my friend. Well done." The vulture of a man knelt and opened the chest. He glanced up once at Bornholm with suspicion, and the professor knew that Charn had somehow sensed that the box had been opened. Still, he seemed satisfied. Bornholm watched as Charn rooted through the box, apparently unsurprised and unimpressed by the priceless contents. At the bottom of the chest he seemed to find what he was seeking, and withdrew it, shaking it loose from the other contents with such carelessness that a large ruby fell in the dirt beside him. "What is it?" Bornholm asked, voice cracking. Charn stood, obviously quite pleased with himself. Entwined in his fingers was a long strand of gold. It was not a chain, exactly, for Bornholm could see no links. The thickness of it should have made the thing stiff and unpliable, and yet it hung loosely from Charn's fingers like a chain, a necklace. That's what it had to be, some sort of necklace. But despite its appearance, the thing had to be made of links of gold so fine and so tightly interwoven that it seemed to be all of a piece, solid metal. "None of your business what it is," Charn replied pleasantly, even as he lifted the chain and slipped it around his throat, fastening it at the back of his neck. "Sir, about the Egyptian project," Bornholm ventured, still fascinated but not wanting the advantage of the moment to slip away. Without warning, Charn's hands lashed out, gripped Bornholm's throat, and began to choke him. The vulture's face transformed, then. Ridges appeared on his brow, and his entire countenance was one of a savage beast. "My God!" Bornholm cried. Charn snarled, baring long fangs. Finally, Bornholm knew what it was he faced. Or thought he did. For in that moment, Charn's face changed again. The flesh was like liquid as it altered beneath the professor's terrified gaze. A moment later, Bornholm found himself eye to eye with himself. His own visage had replaced Charn's, and now he was staring at his own twin, a brutal doppelganger. Charn laughed with Bornholm's voice. Questions rattled through the professor's mind, but he never got the chance to put voice to any of them. Charn's hands, his own hands, closed around Bornholm's throat, and with inhuman strength, began to twist. Benghazi, Libya, June 22nd, 1940. The road was sand and dirt, packed hard by trucks and baked by the harsh and unrelenting sun. After dark it grew cold and the wind picked up, the sand blowing across the desert and scouring every surface with grit. The desert could preserve and it could destroy, much like the sun. As Spike drove a newly stolen truck along the pitiful road outside Benghazi, heading east and deeper into the desert, he glanced from time to time at the moon. The familiar orb was high and fat and yet somehow distant and powerless, unable to offer its usual comfort. He didn't like it here, not at all. The sooner they left northern Africa, the better, as far as he was concerned. "Can you hear them?" Drusilla whispered beside him. Spike glanced at her, then turned his attention back to the treacherous road. Drusilla leaned forward in her seat, staring out the filthy windshield at what she could see of the sky through the blowing sand. "Hear what? Them in the back, you mean?" He tilted his head toward the back of the truck to indicate their captives. Drusilla ignored him, and Spike had known she would. He had loved her long enough to know she had certainly not been referring to the Egyptian watcher and his Libyan trainee in the back of the truck. He half believed that in spite of the blood pumping through their veins, the copper liquid that would make Drusilla mad with hunger, she barely remembered they were there. Humans, the living, breathing kind, sometimes seemed to exist only as ghosts to her. And the things that only she could see, the surreal whispers of other worlds and other powers, those were rich with life and power. There were times when Spike envied her the color and vibrancy of the world in which only she could travel. This was not one of those times. "What are you yammering on about then, Drew?" The truck hit a rut, and they were both jostled. Spike slammed his knee on the bottom of the wide steering wheel and rattled off a few colorful curses. He was on a roll, in a hell of a mood, and flying along with the power of his anger and frustration and the queer dread that filled him. Despite the rough ride, Drusilla had not moved so much as an inch. She also had not responded. "Drew?" he prodded. "Shh." The sibilance of her voice filled the truck's cab, as if the sound itself were capable of magic. Slowly, she turned to regard him. "You're not being very nice. Later, I'll have to punish you for that. Nasty boy. You really don't hear them?" "Hear what?" Spike asked, grumbling but trying not to snap at her. At times, Drusilla seemed impervious to his moods, and at others it was so easy to hurt her feelings. "Ancient whispers, brittle and cruel," Drew told him, eyes darting about as though a flock of birds were flying past the truck. "The world is older here, older than anywhere, I think. The dead were gods once, and stories and poems and songs. They don't even remember what it was like to have flesh, only words and music and then memories.
Not even that anymore. They're on the wind now, and in the sand, and get no more notice than that. Eternal and invisible. It's awful misery, Spike,
Drusilla said, her voice rising, excited.
Suffering forever like that? It's a symphony.
She shivered with pleasure, and Spike smiled indulgently. Times like these he loved her most of all. Still, her pleasure did not dismiss his growing unease about the desert. Despite that all of this was to acquire Freya's strand for her, Drusilla had grown bored with the hunt for slayers and waiting rather quickly. Spike did his best to keep it interesting for her, but the challenge was increasing. There was a turn in the road ahead, and Spike slowed the truck, but stayed straight ahead, bumping up onto the desert sand and driving. Drusilla began to hum something with a kind of ugly, inverted melody beside him, and she kept it up for the hour during which he drove straight into the desert. The truck's tires were oversized, and he had let some of the air out of them. The hissing of sand against the vehicle's undercarriage was almost as annoying as the whimpering that carried, at intervals, up from the rear of the truck. When he judged they had traveled far enough, and enough of the night had passed so that he was anxious to begin the return trip, Spike stopped the lumbering vehicle and climbed out. "Let's go, Drew. We haven't got all bloody night," he said. She seemed awake as if from a trance.
"Oh, goody,"
she drawled, a girlish grin on her features. The watcher and the 15-year-old girl in his care were trussed and gagged, but their eyes were wide as they were both dragged from the back of the truck. Spike did not bother being gentle with the girl, but Drusilla cradled the aging Egyptian watcher as though he were an enormous infant. She cooed to him, whispering to him all the while of the agony he was soon to endure and how sweet it would be. He would plead for death, she promised, but there would be no one to hear. The girl wept copiously as Spike and Drusilla stripped her watcher bare and then drove long wooden posts into the sand, deep enough to hold him tight. They bound him to these posts, face up to the sky. He would be there when the sun rose, and for days and nights thereafter, more than likely. This far into the desert, it seemed inconceivable that anyone might come along to save him. He would die there, burnt and dehydrated by the sun. But there was that small chance that he might be found. A tiny chance, but enough so that he did not dare leave the girl the same way. The watcher was a bonus. It did not really matter if he was saved. The girl, though, her death was required as part of the bargain they had made with Skrymir. Spike made certain that they were within sight of her struggling watcher. The man screamed through his gag as the vampire lovers embraced the girl from either side, holding her between them, each dipping their fangs into her throat on opposite sides. Together like that, sharing so intimately, they drained her in what seemed like no time at all. They left her corpse next to the watcher. Before they went back to the truck, Spike stood and looked down at the man, whose eyes were wide and maddened. "Sweet dreams, Gov." In the truck, on the way back, Drusilla hummed to herself quite contentedly. The song was far more melodic than the one she had entertained herself with on the ride out, and it gave her a little ripple of pleasure that made her shiver. "Enjoying yourself, pet?" Spike asked. Drusilla swung her head toward him, and her hair fell across her face in a cascade of darkness. She gazed up at him from behind the curtain of her hair with a knowing look that she knew drove Spike wild. "Don't give me that look, Drew, or I'll have to stop the truck right here. You know I can't resist you, and I'd rather not still be in the desert when the sun comes up, truck or no truck." She gave him a mischievous grin. Then her mind wandered back to what had brought them out to the desert in the first place. "It was fun seeing his eyes," she whispered. "He'll cook up nice, that one. A shame we couldn't stay to watch." "If you say so, love." Suddenly, as the wind might shift, her mood changed. Drusilla pouted, her head tilting away from her man, her hands coming up protectively in front of her face. "Spike," she said tentatively, in a little girl voice that she knew could make him do nearly anything. "I'm bored." With a shake of his head, Spike sighed. "Of course you are, Drew. What would you like me to do to alleviate that boredom? You want the damned necklace, don't you?" "Oh, yes," she said, excited again by the thought of sparkly things, the games they might play with the strand, and the possibility of seeing her reflection. "I want it very much. You tell me I'm beautiful, but in my mind I have no face." "Well, then." She considered for a moment. "Thought I saw 2 girls in America on that list. I like America. Vulgar people there, and all so different." Spike stared at her, ignoring the rigors of driving for a moment. "Bloody hell, Drew! We already agreed that the only logical way to go about all this mess was to save the American girls for last. It'd be daft to go all the way out there and then back to finish the job." Drusilla pouted, arms folded up beneath her chin, and stared out the window at the swirling sand. The truck rumbled on toward the road they had left, and the coast of Libya beyond that, and Spike grumbled behind the wheel. "On the other hand," Spike muttered. "Yes?" Drew asked quickly, smiling, turning toward him again and bouncing on her seat. "Wherever our little murderous jaunts take us, we'll have to go back up to Norway to collect your birthday present when we're all done." Not to mention, Skrymir doesn't want us killing the Slayer until we're done with all her substitutes. If we stick around here, we're liable to run into her before we're through. Maybe heading off to America isn't the worst idea.
Do you really mean it, Spike?
Drew asked, deeply sincere. Spike reached across the torn seat and twined his fingers with hers. I mean it, Poodle, he announced. America it is. She grinned and clapped in elation. Then she looked at him sternly.
I'm still going to punish you later.
Wouldn't have it any other way. Briare, France, June 26th. The days had grown long and warm. A breeze rustled the trees that dotted the property of the small farm on the outskirts of Briare, where they had hidden themselves away for several days. The sun sank lower on the horizon, and the trees' shadows reached across the ground towards Sophie, who sat on the front steps of the house and sharpened the sword she had inherited from her father. As she bent to the work, she whistled a tune her mother had sung to her as an infant, barely aware that the music was in her head. Sophie had grown restless. There had been fewer and fewer vampires abroad after dark, and she yearned to return to Copenhagen or at least to London. She felt she would be put to better use in either city. The operatives Havisham and Ruby had left earlier that day to meet with a contact who would bring word to the council that they had all felt it was time to move on. The war had fallen into a kind of lull, and so had the vampiric activity that had accompanied it. Yenna thought it was quite probable that the creatures were simply gone. Sophie agreed. The vampires had not expected the fighting to end so quickly. The Germans had been too successful, from the point of view of the supernatural predators that had prowled the battlefields. Many of them had traveled great distances when the war broke out so that they could feast upon the wounded and the strays. France had seemed like a paradise for a few short weeks. Then Paris had fallen, the north of France conquered by the Germans. Under the leadership of Marshal Pétain, the southern half of the nation, now referred to as Vichy France, had agreed to an armistice with Hitler. They had conceded the free half of the country to German dominance without any further aggression, without even burdening the Nazis with the effort it would have taken to send a conquering army south. There was a resistance, of course. In occupied France, and in the south as well, there were those working as part of an underground to fight against the Nazis, to spy on them and sabotage their efforts wherever possible. That was no help to the vampires. War was chaos. Victory was order, particularly under the Nazis. Under the focused light of order, the vampires would simply draw too much attention if they continued to hunt there. So they left. Not all of them, of course, but a great many departed France to return to their homes. Some, expecting the Nazis to continue west, had reportedly crossed the Channel to England. Sophie had been sent to France to fight a war of light and darkness, but her war had moved on. When she finished sharpening the sword, she sheathed the blade and carried it into the farmhouse. In the kitchen, Yenna sat at a table cutting vegetables. Or she had been doing so when Sophie had gone out onto the steps. When the Slayer entered the kitchen, she saw that her watcher was immobile, eyes locked on some far distant point, face expressionless. She was having another vision. Sophie knew better than to interrupt Yenna during one, but sometimes she could not help studying the watcher when she was in such a trance. She is aware that, in some way, it was rude to observe something so intimate. Still, she stood in the kitchen for a few moments, studying Yenna's face. Sophie frowned. Usually the woman was expressionless during her visions. This time, however, there was a small smile at the corners of Yenna's mouth, and her eyebrows and nostrils twitched from time to time. Without warning, Yenna's expression changed. She gave a little gasp and then slumped to the table, her forehead making a solid thunk on the wood, scaring cut vegetables and coming dangerously near the blade of the knife in her hand. The knife clattered to the ground. "Yenna!" Sophie cried. Alarmed, she went to the watcher and pulled her upright. Yenna's eyes were not closed as Sophie had expected, but heavy-lidded and vacant, as though she were almost asleep, but not quite. Sophie had once destroyed a demon who had been addicted to opium. His expression, cloud over the euphoria of the drug, had not been unlike Yenna's now. Blank. Gone. As though her mind had traveled from her body and not returned. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she recalled that in her studies she had learned that it was not uncommon for seers to lose some of the perspective others had. Their visions were sometimes so real that over time they left those gifted with them divorced from the tangible world, unable to tell the difference. At best, this left them confused. At worst, totally unhinged. If Yenna were beginning to show signs of such a development, Sophie would have to tell her, might even have to request a new watcher. The thought of doing such a thing grieved her, but more importantly, she feared for her friend and mentor. If Sophie remembered correctly, the kind of detachment that often came from a seer's encroaching madness could lead to an indecisiveness that could be dangerous in their profession, as well as paranoia, neurosis, and even, in extreme cases, catatonia. "Yenna," she rasped, emotion catching in her throat, "please be all right, please?" Her eyes burning with unshed tears, Sophie pushed stray strands of Yenna's usually meticulously controlled hair away from her face and shook the woman ever so slightly. "Yenna," she said, a bit more forcefully. The Watcher inhaled deeply, as though she had been suffocating and was only now granted breath. Her eyelids flared and her gaze began to clear. Yenna blinked, shook herself a bit, and then glanced over at Sophie. When she saw that the girl had been studying her, the Watcher flushed as though embarrassed or angry. Sophie decided it must have been the latter.
I'm sorry, she said quickly. I just walked in a moment ago, and you seemed distressed. You were gone. It was another vision,
Yenna told her curtly. Sophie nodded.
Yes,
she thought.
But was that all it was?
Yenna took a deep breath, seemed about to chide Sophie for her discourtesy, and then sighed. The vampire again, she admitted.
Spike?
Sophie asked.
This is your third vision of him, yet they're all so unclear. What do you suppose it means?
Fourth, Yenna corrected.
I wish I knew what it meant, truth be told. The visions are unnerving.
Talk of Spike seemed to make Yenna fidgety and anxious. She glanced about the room a bit, scratched her head, and her eyes took on a faraway look that was not unlike her expression during a vision. It was as though, even now, she was not looking at the room, but at the remnants of her vision, at Spike.
You said you saw him once before, but you did not tell me where,
Sophie reminded her, mostly to get her attention.
Do you want me to stop asking?
Yenna sighed and shook her head.
I only saw him for a moment. It was in 1929. I had just become a Watcher after years of training. I went out to celebrate with Edgar Somers, who had been my mentor in the council. We walked afterward, hand in hand. I was quite fond of Edgar. He was such a good man, and wise. A true scholar. He was attempting to catalog vampires, and had been looking into the backgrounds of many of them. Including Spike, Sophie said softly.
Yenna nodded.
Edgar walked me home. I stood on the front steps of the building where I was staying in London, and Edgar stared into my eyes. I closed them, thinking he meant to kiss me. He made the tiniest noise, and when I opened my eyes, he was falling away down the stairs, dead. Spike stood before me. He kissed me, once, very softly. Then he was gone. His lips felt very cold. Oh my God, Sophie whispered. He is so very cruel, Yenna said, voice cracking with emotion. Evil radiates from him. Yet he is also quite fascinating. So charismatic. With a scowl, Sophie crossed the table and sat down. She took Yenna's hand in her own and studied the older woman's eyes. He is a vampire, Yenna. You do remember that, don't you? Your visions mean that we are likely to face him, and soon. No matter how charismatic he may be, he is a demon, a savage, brutal monster. Look what he did to your Edgar. We cannot afford to be fascinated. Sophie hesitated, almost afraid to broach the subject, but she knew she had to. She did gently. Wherever your visions take you, Yenna, you must come back from there. Back to me, to the duties of the council has given you. He may be there in your visions, but they are not reality. Merely a way for the power that gave you this gift to communicate with you. Spike is evil. If your visions take you to him, you must always come back. You must have the strength to come back. Yes, of course, Yenna said, waving Sophie's words away as though they offended her. Do you take me for a fool? Spike must die, but there is no harm in studying a unique specimen. Edgar would have appreciated the need for observation. I suppose, Sophie allowed, but she saw the thoughtful expression on her watcher's face and was not convinced. Though neither of them was very good at it, they prepared dinner together. Havisham was really the chef among them, but he and Ruby had not yet returned, and Sophie did not want to wait until it was much later before they could sit down for their evening meal. As luck would have it, the two council operatives returned a mere 10 minutes before dinner was ready. The truck rumbled loudly as they drove it around the back of the farmhouse and into the barn. When Ruby came through the back door with his face pale and slack, Sophie presumed it had been Havisham's driving that had disturbed him so. But then the tall, neatly dressed Havisham entered as well, and Sophie's eyes went wide. Her heart began to race. Havisham wore an expression of total horror, and yet there was a grimly determined set to his jaw as well. All thoughts of dinner dissipated. What is it? Sophie demanded. What have you learned? We are not going back to England right away, Ruby replied, eyes blindly gazing about the kitchen. Though we're not staying in France either. Yenna rose and went to Mr. Havisham. She seemed perfectly fine now, and Sophie wondered if she had overreacted earlier, if her fears about Yenna's visions and increasing distance and despondency were unwarranted. She hoped so, and looking at her now, she could almost believe it. This was the Yenna she knew, direct and confident. The watcher stood just in front of Havisham, staring up at his face to get his attention, tiny in front of this tall man. Please, Mr. Havisham, what has happened? Why do the two of you seem so grave? She asked. Havisham took a breath and nodded his head. I'm sorry, Miss Norvik. It's only that some of them were my friends, you see. Some of who? Yenna asked anxiously. The Watchers, Ruby explained. Sophie studied the ruddy-faced little man and saw the anger begin to break through the grief that had overwhelmed him. Fury blossomed within him, set his teeth on edge.
so that when he spoke again, it was with a hatred she had not previously been able to imagine him capable of. "We have all been reassigned," he explained. "Haversham and I are to return to England. The two of you are to embark immediately for America. Your mission has become a singular one."
"America?" Sophie asked, startled. "What for?"
Haversham cleared his throat, face still etched with horror and disbelief. "Last month, a pair of vampires managed to get into the council headquarters in London and murder 2 of its members. No one was the wiser at the time, but seems they also copied a list of slayers in waiting." Sophie frowned and shot a questioning glance at Yenna. Her watcher would not meet her gaze, but she did explain.
"The council expends a great deal of energy in identifying those girls around the world to whom portents and omens point as potential candidates to become the chosen one. Those deemed most likely are sought out and trained, as I trained you, in hopes that the next time a new slayer is chosen, it'll be one of those we have already trained. You'd be surprised how well that system works." "My replacements," Sophie replied in Danish, "for when I die."
Yenna nodded.
"Yes, that's exactly right."
The slayer took that in, closed her eyes a moment, and then turned to the operatives again.
"These vampires, they're killing slayers in waiting, aren't they? And they're watchers?"
"That's right," Haversham confirmed.
"How many so far?"
Sophie asked, stomach roiling with revulsion. 5 candidates, Ruby replied. 4 watchers. One of them lived. Well, 6 watchers now, counting the 2 in London. The councils had scryers searching for them magically, and operatives all over England are trying to figure out where they'll go next.
"And they believe it's to be America,"
Yenna said, putting it together. Sophie waited for more from her, but the watcher said nothing. It was not unusual for her now. Some of her visions were quite direct and helpful, clairvoyant warnings of the future. Others were merely images, feelings, vague hints of danger. The visions of Spike had been like that, and there had been many. After each one, Yenna seemed to slow down a bit, and defer to Sophie more.
"So be it,"
she thought. The slayer stood up from the table, carrying her father's sword in its sheath.
"For us as well. We leave immediately," she said.
Sophie strode toward the bedroom that she and Yenna had been sharing. Before she reached the door, she turned to regard the councilmen again. A question had occurred to her, one to which she was certain she already knew the answer.
"These vampires, what are their names?"
"The female is Drusilla," Ruby told her. "The male is called Spike."
"Of course,"
Sophie replied grimly. She felt a dire apprehension bloom in her gut, but when she glanced over at her watcher, she saw that Yenna's expression was very different. She seemed almost happy, excited, while the slayer was filled only with dread.